You're listening to Radio 97 on this Thursday morning. It's time to talk law with our resident lawyer, Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay. She's with us every Thursday to offer her legal expertise, provide some general advice on the latest of hot topics. Those hot topics come thick and fast. She has experience spanning more than 25 years in the areas of property and commercial law. And she also prepares wills as part of estate planning and litigation. She's with us once again. Hi, Despina.
Hi, Wayne. Hi, Brooke.
Good morning, Despina. Another week already of talking law. This first segment is all about de facto relationships, one particular court case that is so interesting. So we thought we'd just break it down because it's all about de facto relationships and what happens if they end. We don't want it to end, but if it does end, how does it affect yourself in terms of your properties, your assets, what you own? Despina, can you explain, de facto relationships, what happens if they end?
Okay, so just to be clear, just like I said last week with that interesting criminal case we were looking at, so I'm not a family lawyer. So if you're going through a breakup, whether it's a marriage or a de facto relationship, or you're about to enter into a de facto relationship, or you think you are, or you're about to get married and you want advice, you should go and see a family lawyer who specializes in that area. The reason why I want to mention this today, this topic is we've had a recent High Court case. And you know I love High Court cases because...
We all do,
Yes.
It's the ultimate, yeah.
It's the ultimate in Australia. And this show is about updating people generally about what's happened in the law and what they should be aware of so they can go and get, if they need to, that specialty advice from their different lawyers in different areas. So this is a case that was determined recently in the High Court, and it's called Fairburn and Radecki. Okay, and it was about a de facto relationship that had ended. And the point of this case, and it started at a trial, went to the Court of Appeal, and then ended up in the High Court. So it's a very important, significant case because it was a case that determined when all the features that the court looked at to determine when the de facto relationship had irretrievably broken down and had ended. Okay, and that's important to determine because when a de facto relationship ends, that's the point when you can go and apply for property orders in a separation. Yeah.
I don't know. To me, when I first heard about this High Court case, immediately, and I'm hoping other people, our listeners, may be thinking the same, the fact that we're not talking about a marriage. We're talking about a regular de facto relationship, which some people might think, well, I'm not binded in any sense to this person. So how can it get me into trouble like this? But it obviously can.
Oh, look, it can, in that when you say trouble, I mean, look, when you go into a de facto relationship, and you are in that relationship, it's determined to be that. When the relationship ends, what happens to your assets and what happens with the division of those assets, just like in a marriage that ends up in divorce. So there are similar things that need to be determined. And in this was an interesting case, and we might go through some of the facts of the case because it wasn't just a typical, well, people were living together and then they weren't, and then they separated and then it ended. It actually had some unique features to it, which made it, I suppose, difficult for the parties to work out, and then ultimately the court to determine when the relationship ended. Okay, so we'll go through those briefly. In 2005 and 6, they the couples commenced living together, but their assets were separated. So they lived together, but they had separated assets. So you can be in a de facto relationship if that happens. You don't have to combine all your assets together. There are a whole lot of factors that would determine if you're in a de facto relationship. So they lived together, assets were separated, but the house was owned by the female partner. Okay, so in 2010, they actually entered into a cohabitation agreement, which is like a prenuptial agreement if you're about to get married. So they entered into a cohabitation agreement, which talked about keeping the assets separated and what happens if they ended the relationship and how would the assets be divided. Okay.
So the cohabitation agreement is basically a certificate, a binding document to say, yep, I'm in a relationship with this person.
Yes, and it talks about the assets and liabilities, and if the relationship ends, how do those assets and liabilities get divvied up and worked out. Okay, so this cohabitation agreement basically quarantined their own property, so kept it separated, including her home. Unfortunately, 5 years later, the female partner started to suffer rapid cognitive decline, and then in 2017, she was diagnosed with dementia. So some interesting things that were coming through in their relationship. So between 2015 and 2017, you see the parties started to live in separate bedrooms, but still under the one house. And they started to spend more time independently because of her decline, unfortunately. Then he went away for 3 months on a holiday, came back, and then started to convince her, when she was very vulnerable, to sign a power of attorney in his favour and to make a new will, which changed quite a few things again in his favour, about having a right to reside in her property until he died, regardless of what happened to her. Yeah, so that was a significant factor that'll come through the case. So after all that happened, there was a bit of arguments between him and the adult children of the female partner through that time. The children didn't like what he was doing. And ultimately what happened is the children actually got a trustee involved to start to make decisions for her personal care and her welfare. And they determined it was actually best she had to move to an aged care facility.
Wow.
So you might say, okay, well, that must have been the point that the relationship ended, but it wasn't the essential feature that came out of this case that determined when it ended. So once this person moved into an aged care facility, what happened was that the trustee said, look, we've got to sell her home, because remember the home was in her name. We've got to sell the home to help her fund her care. Now, this is the clincher. His conduct after that, he said, I'm not going to move out. I'm not going to consent to any sale of the home. In fact, why don't you use her super to fund her welfare? So I'm just not going to cooperate. So he continued to do that. So that by his own conduct, what he was doing, as the court said, is he was actually making it very clear that he no longer wanted to be in a relationship. So it was his very own conduct at the end of the day. And I know we've rushed through a few things and features here, but what the point I wanted to get across is that it's not just one factor with a de facto relationship as to when it ends. It's not necessarily you're living in separate rooms. No, not necessarily. You have plenty of married couples and other couples that live under the one roof happily, but they're living in separate bedrooms. You could even have a de facto relationship when you're living in separate houses. Okay. So there's not one determining factor. In this case, the court said, well, it wasn't when she went to the aged care facility either, because that would be an absolute injustice to deem a relationship ended just because one of them had dementia, for example, and needed care in a care facility. We would never deem that to occur. They could still be in a relationship. So
Despina, can we have a look at a couple of the factors that you might use to say, yes, a de facto relationship has come to an end?
So in this case, what they highlighted and what all the family lawyers are talking about is the conduct of the partner, the male partner here. So what we're talking about is when you come together in a marriage or a de facto relationship, particularly, the court was talking about, well, you're coming together and there's a mutual agreement to a shared life. Okay. So if you, by your conduct, show an intention that mutual agreement to share that life together basically has ceased, has ended, and you show that through conduct like he did. For example, I'm not going to support her. I'm not going to agree to the sale of the home. Why don't you use her super to help her? I'm not going to help. I'm not going to cooperate. And demonstrating that he made her do a will which was to his favor and not her, about having a right to live in the home until he passed away. So this was all showing an intention, well, I really don't want to be with this person anymore. And that was the essential feature that came out, the conduct of the parties. So really, really important. So as I said, you could be in separate bedrooms, you could be in separate houses and separate properties, but it all comes down to your intention. How do you show the intention that you want to be together, to share your life with someone, and there's a mutual agreement and understanding to do that? You see, and just by having joint assets is not enough sometimes, or by living under the one roof is not enough.
Now, the Cohabitation Agreement, can we briefly look at that? You've mentioned that a couple of times. Would you suggest most people who are in a de facto relationship look at something like that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it should be determined by each couple themselves. There's not I suppose, a black and white answer that you should or should not. What I can say is, if you are about to get married and you want to enter into a prenuptial agreement, it's got to be done right. The same with the cohabitation agreement, because they're both considered binding financial agreements by the Family Law Act. So if you're going to do that, you've got to get a good family lawyer who knows what they're doing to have it done correctly, because these agreements can also be unwound. They can seem to be void down the track if they're not done properly, and each party's got to get independent legal advice. So it can be there to protect the parties, particularly if one party has a lot of assets coming into a relationship and that other party doesn't have any. So it can be there to preserve that wealth, but I think it's got to be different for each couple moving forward.
Yeah, circumstantial. Very interesting stuff. Again, thank you so much, Despina from Boutique Law Firm. Despina Boutique Law Firm, Priala Legal. I'm just saying Despina Priala, Boutique Law Firm, Priala Legal. And coming up next, Queenslanders, did your home get damaged in the floods? We'll be discussing the Resilient Home Fund, a $741 million package to help repair homes across South East Queensland. That's coming up in just a moment. You're listening to Talking Law on Radio 97.